Hello everyone, my name is Dhiren and I'm the VP and head of the corporate business vertical for staffing at TeamLease. Today organizations are navigating a talent landscape shaped by rapid market shifts, evolving workforce expectations and ongoing economic uncertainty. Aligning talent strategy with market realities is no longer a future goal. It's a present day imperative. From workforce planning and skills transformation to leadership capability and culture talent decisions are now deeply tied to business resilience and growth, especially when this comes to a global market scale. So today to discuss this very exciting topic with us, we have Rupali Gupta. So a quick introduction about Rupali. She currently serves as the Group CHRO at Captain Fresh, a postgraduate from XLRI, and has worked across multiple global companies, including Conferry, Mercer, Accenture, and more. So Rupali, thank you for taking the time out and welcome to our podcast today.
Good morning, Dhiren, and thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Rupali, I think one thing with respect to your background that was very evident and came glaring at us was the kind of exposure you've actually had from a global marketplace, where you actually worked with multiple companies, understood and seen how companies really scale. So from that perspective, I think one of the first questions that comes to mind is what do you think would be one of the key requirements from a leadership perspective to get teams align themselves and their interests for a global scale?
Wonderful. And I'll quickly just weave in, I'll step back a little bit and weave in the fact that, I have worked across Asia Pacific in deep. The last 12 years I've spent in Singapore. I have also worked across US, Europe, Japan, Korea, a couple of other geographies. And the reason I'm sharing that is because, one is research, which most of us can do. And the second is experiential learning, which I bring. But if I answer your question in a single line, I think it would be this openness to experimentation. When you think about organizations from Japan or from Korea or from the US, and you start thinking about how the headquarters look, right? The headquarters are mainly dominated by where the company started from. So that nationality, that way of thinking, that way of work, and it makes sense. A lot of Indian companies also work like that. At the same time, I think the one big trait or one big nuance of most Indians is that, we are so diverse. Given the size of our country, given the number of languages we speak, given how diverse we are, we're just more open to different inputs. We're open to experimenting. And I think that over time plays a large role in the ability to understand, accept, adapt, and then gently bring about change where needed in the markets and cultures that we work in. Now, there's a lot of cons, which we can get to later, but I hope that answers the question you started.
No, it sure definitely does, Rupali. So today we have a lot of the youth coming into the whole workforce stream as such, and few of them have their own set of priorities and could see varying commitment levels as such, right? Now, it comes to a global scale. The expectations to create a world-class standard and the likes would be very, very critical. So as you rightly said, experimentation is something that actually is a very critical thing. So can you just help me understand that from your experience, what would be one of the best ways to give teams flexibility to experiment, learn, fail, iterate, and then take it to the next level?
That's a wonderful question, Dhiren. Right. So when you think about American multinationals, there is this whole focus on structure. There's a lot of focus on performance. There's clear articulation on value added, you progress, and there's a lot of clarity on performance, outcomes, structure, goals. What also happens then is because the ecosystems are so stable, there's very little room for failure. How are large organizations creating these grounds for experimentation? A lot of these large organizations, to be honest, are struggling. They've got so set in their ways of work, they've got so set in their processes because that is what has made them excellent. Now, having spent the last year in India and with a startup, it's almost a default. There is no other option but to experiment, right? When I see the thriving world of startups, there is no other option. They start with an idea, they pivot, they're finding their product market fit, they're changing, and it's almost baked into the DNA. And through this journey when I talk to people on the other side, larger organizations, looking at, how are you doing this? How have you shaped your industry? How have you shaped your workforce? They come back and talk about some of the fundamentals that startups have. You're experimenting by default, not by choice. You're constantly open to adapting because that is the only way to succeed.
Got it. Very nicely summed up, Rupali. For all those who are listening right now, I think one thing that they might want to understand from your consultant stint, that when it comes to innovation, right, as you said, experimentation, innovation, there would be possibly a certain kind of a budget that would be required to kept aside to ensure that people can actually go about experimenting with their thoughts, right? So from your perspective, again, just to, if in case you could help me with an answer, from a company's perspective, what kind of budgets should they really look at to be kept out for innovation, especially from a startup space? I know you're currently working with a startup, but keeping that aside, more from a consulting perspective, innovation is the key. And if you do not invest out over there, take the risk, it gets a little difficult. So would you have some thoughts on how to actually invest in people and go about leveraging on this whole thing?
So investing in people for innovation in a startup, why don't I give you both perspectives, right? Let's start with the startup. I think the key part in the startup, like I said, innovation is baked into the design. I think what startups need a little bit more of is some sort of structure and guidelines on where are the decision boundaries, when do you escalate, what does good look like, what does failure look like, and how quickly do you ask for help? Because also what I've seen is, people burn a lot of time, effort, energy, and money, and that becomes a slippery slope because they don't know when to pull back. So a little bit of guidance on, or a little bit of whether it's founder time, whether it's a panel, but somebody looking into progress. So people are not left alone, right? That's what happens with a very unstructured environment. People do whatever they want, and then, they're running in so many different directions, but some sort of coming together, looking at what's happening, where are we heading, are we getting what we wanted? So some sort of structure more than investment, some sort of mentorship in terms of, how can we invest in people. I think with startups, the biggest ROI would be mentorship. How do we create a pool of the wise ones, provide access to them, and mentor without judgment? So, rather than investors looking at it and judging, or, there's also a lot of judgment that happens in this world. Just creating that safe space for mentorship rather than judgment. I think that would be the second. I don't think money or time is really the issue in a smaller setup or in a startup. Now coming to large enterprises, sometimes what happens is, and sometimes you don't even need the money, or you need really small funds to spark ideas. What gets lost is the voice of an employee. What are people looking for in their work? They're pretty much looking for clarity. Where am I? Where am I going? Where is this company going? They're looking for communication. How are we doing? What is expected out of me? Am I heading in the right direction? Whether you call it communication, you call it feedback, it's in the same bucket. And the third thing, these are just broad buckets. The third thing people are looking for is how do I know how I'm doing, which is rewards, recognition. So really a result, closure on it, right? So when you think about large organizations, what gets lost in the large volume is the voice of an employee. When I have an idea, what do I do with it? I take it to my peer or my manager. The teams are so large. I have such a large volume, day-to-day way of working that idea and the voice gets lost. So sometimes it's as simple as running maybe a hackathon, coming up with, burning business problems. And I've done this in the past with one of the pharmaceutical companies I worked with, coming up with ideas that are led by employees. You've seen, and you've probably heard of this, there are a number of organizations that run leadership development programs. They come up with what they call either action learning projects or something similar, business projects, action learning projects. And these are typically, what they do is they put people in a room, they let them brainstorm, they come up with an idea. It doesn't have buy-in, it dies a death. A mix of both. Having burning business problems that the business and the CEO and the leadership or the board are trying to solve, put that in front of people. Ask them to generate ideas with a purpose, which is directly contributing to the organization. And then from there, pick the best ideas, run your products. It could be fast experimentation, and none of that takes a lot of money. It takes time, it takes an ecosystem, and it takes just that investment.
You know what? You actually highlighted really well where ideas a dime a dozen, but implementation is one of the key things. And implementation really doesn't happen because you don't have the right kind of a environment or the support that could kick in from an environment from a company primarily to aid, right? This also requires a very significant cultural shift from a company. I mean, let's say if in case you have a large organization who primarily is focusing on just numbers, doesn't have innovation or doesn't really have the setup or infrastructure for hearing the people. So if there is a cultural shift and organizations need to take one step at a time, just your thoughts on how could they move from one of the traditional organizations to one of the organizations where action learning projects as an approach is taken to the next level.
Three things that would go in creating that what I would call a thriving learning by doing kind of culture, right? The first is back to clarity. Is there clarity on what are we chasing? Why are we doing it? It really starts with the why. Why should we be investing time, effort, energy, focus into an initiative? Attention flows, energy flows where attention goes, right? So why are we giving this attention? That's the first question. Is the why strong enough? Is the problem that we want to solve large enough? Is it going to take us to the next phase of where we are as a company or what we could do? A lot of ideas or a lot of initiatives that get done for the sake of checkboxing, because it's the right thing, because it's required, because it's best practice, will only take companies to mediocre. It will never make somebody excellent. So back to, why should we invest in this if that's clear? Then starting with business critical problems. I think a lot of open market. Now, what typically happens with open market spaces is employees would feel worried, oh, if I'm putting my hand up for this initiative, will it look to my manager like I have a lot of time? Will I get more work? Will it affect my performance? But when it comes from leadership, when it comes from, here are the mission critical projects in the organization, we're looking for options, ideas, who wants to sign up, who wants to be part of the panel, who wants to be part of a lot of democratization. And that's what Gen Z is looking for. They're not waiting for, someone to give them structure, to give them a problem. They are great at organizing, coming together, bringing that energy up front, as long as they're connected to a purpose. So giving them the purpose, giving them the problem, and giving them the space without micromanaging. I think those three things, plus from a leadership perspective, having the focus on why we are doing this, what these problems are, and how will the solution add value to us. That would be the spark. And then there would be a long tail under where showing quick wins, generating enough champions, talking about who's done what, that then keeps the momentum going.
Got it. Very nice. So, Rupali, with the Gen Z, right, since you did highlight or pick up on the term, one thing that we've noticed is attrition levels from this particular cadre of kids is pretty high. I mean, back in our days, we would possibly stick with the same company for 5, 8, 10 years kind of a thing. Now there is a very short span of a year and a half or two for quite a few people, right? So from a company perspective, while creating this right kind of an environment, would be one of the key to ensure this talent actually stays. Would there be any other thoughts that you have, let's say a buddy system, a mentorship program, or a growth plan? I mean, again, since you've actually been in consulting, would love to hear your thoughts around ensuring that the Gen Z can deliver to their very best.
So, let's go back one step again, Dhiren, and say, why are Gen Z leaving? What are they saying in their, again, I can't tell you from my small sample, but if we look at research around Gen Z, there's really, again, very fundamental reasons they're leaving. They're not tolerating poor management or poor leadership the way millennials or Gen X's did, right? The second is, let's remember where they're coming from. They're coming from a lot of families with working parents. They're coming from families with either wealth or, middle class, upper middle class. So in short, they have options compared to what the current millennials or Gen X did, right? So the options, the opportunity, the safety net is there. Once you're operating from a safe space, you're taken care of. For most Gen Z, if they leave their homes, and you'll see, again, data will point to how many of them are living with their parents, because the minute they step out, their quality of life is going to drop significantly. Right. And versus if I compare that with most of us, our quality of life only went up from the time we started working. So that's the first place. Why do they work? They work because they care about the problems that they are solving. They
Great.
care about the direction in which they are going. And third, because they want to be around the people they have. And the last reason or the last, factor for Gen Zs would be they're so much into health and wellness. Now, when you think about what with this profile, what will they not tolerate? They're not going to tolerate poor managers, toxic leadership, endless work hours, and and lack of purpose. So just doing something for the sake of doing it. This is where most of their misalignment happens. Now, with the high attrition, what does that tell us? Almost scary. Maybe we should ask that question and flip it back to the companies. Are we propagating any of those four things I talked about that Gen Z will not tolerate? And then what are we doing to address it?
Got it. As you rightly said, I mean, they're slightly different, and the safe space zone was so aptly put by you, where these kids are very comfortable right now, and they actually have the right ability to experiment. So these kids could actually be a very interesting trigger for experimentation within a company. But yeah, they need to be well into it. Great.
This generation therein is dying to experiment, and what they are effectively communicating back to us is you're stopping my pace of learning, you're slowing down my pace of doing and of what I can do. And the minute you find that sweet spot of when they are aligned, there's just so much energy and so much. Their network is phenomenal. There's so much network that they unleash, and there's so many ways they solve the same problem, which is different from they are great people to start a project. Then it could kind of hand off to millennials to, stabilize it and put in place structures and processes. Expecting that out of Gen Z would be wrong. It's very interesting how multi generations could work together between starting a project, running a project, closing off a project, giving vision, direction, guidance to a project. And when we start bringing all of those skills within the company together, it just changes the way we engage.
Got it. I like the way you actually put out saying that flexibility could be one of the key requirements for them to strive, right? What kind of an environment would be ideal, both from a Indian perspective and a global scale perspective, with respect to flexibility of work and the like? So, what would your take be around that, Rupali?
I would think if them again, it kind of comes back to work from office, doesn't it? And it comes back to work from office for a couple of reasons. What's getting lost in the workplace today with a lot of flexibility and the whole wave of companies asking for people to come back to office is stemming in two things. The first is, leaders feeling like, oh, I'm paying all these salaries, I can't see people, I don't know what work is happening, productivity is slowing, we don't know what information is going out where, given, AI, given the lacks or the use of VPNs or, the lax internet usage that we might see. So that's one, which is like a slightly reasonable reason. The second is this workforce that is coming in because a lot of them have finished college and they've, worked through COVID. They are so comfortable with tech first, talk next, or people next. They are also missing out on interpersonal connections. Now, when you think about, and I'm going to weave in a couple of things here. Work from office is an important thing which I'm bringing in, right? It's important because that's when they see people. That's when they see the ways of work. That's when they figure out what the culture of a place is. That's where they meet people to collaborate, to build on ideas. I know that a lot of them are very comfortable collaborating with AI, but there is value in human experience and interpretation of what AI can give you and the data that comes out. The second bit, why it's important to, kind of come, show face, engage, is to be able to showcase and talk about your work, brainstorm ideas, leave those, with a few other people, test and ideate and bring back inputs. So, just that whole bit around being around other leaders, getting other perspectives becomes important. It's the purpose, it's back to the purpose. Why should they turn up? Why should they engage? The environment of the right kind of collaboration, access to the right people or access to most people, breaking down those boundaries and hierarchies, creating these opportunities for, here's a problem, here's what I'm solving, here's where I am, here's where I need help or not, or here's my progress, creating some system or some sort of progress review, if I may call it, without being too bureaucratic, but just that kind of, test and check. And this could be remote, this could be in person, this could be anywhere in the world, it could be digital nomad. That kind of flexibility is something they would love. Again, a lot of people, even when they're traveling, are working. The option or the opportunity to say, okay, if I'm going on holiday to, somewhere, and I have the option of extending it by a week, spending time in that office, this is not something most companies opened up to people in the past, right? But thinking like that and saying, how do I create those networks of people, of knowledge that expand across globally, so that everybody is getting the best of all worlds? Because, a lot of knowledge flow in organizations happens from the top. Just creating that robust osmosis of people being able to mingle across would be wonderful.
Got it. Yeah, no, technology definitely has aided. Prior to COVID, I don't think any of us could have thought of really doing a work from home on a very regular or a consistent basis. Technology has aided the whole thing and just made us realize that we have moved one step ahead. But having said that, your ideas that are shared across a cup of coffee can never happen with the help of technology, right? So coming to a workplace, working definitely plays a very, very critical role.
And even water cooler conversations, they're so great for mental health.
Yeah, yeah, very aptly put. You're right. In fact, a stress buster in its own ways, as you've said. So very, very important. So good. So Rupali, it was nice to actually hear your thoughts on how you create purpose, give clarity, and give space to people to actually strive. We heard your thoughts around how the Gen Z is looking at the current space and the reasons why some of them really strive and some don't. Having a voice for people gets very, very critical and giving them the flexibility to implement. Now, if I'm to go one step ahead and look at the topmost level, right, from a leadership perspective, especially for those who are looking at going global, from an Indian perspective, an Indian company, a company which really want to go. There are a lot of these cross-cultural nuances, and the thought process, I guess, from a leader would be completely different to start thinking bigger. While some of them possibly will have it inherent and have the ability to do it, would love to hear a few of your thoughts because you've seen companies go global or you've seen global companies. What would be the key things to actually focus from a talent perspective to ensure that success is there on the corner?
I think a couple of things, and again, it starts therein with this whole, the why. Why are we going global? How big is the market? Is it founded in logic, in rationale, in reality? What are the nuances? The second bit is then uncovering that market. What are the nuances of that market, right? So more from a business strategy, but also from a people lens. What is the average workforce like? What are the skills that they are bringing? What are the pitfalls of working with this country? When you think about, and let's not name countries, but let's see, you have countries that are working super hard, super long hours, burning their people out. You have countries that are on the other end of the spectrum that are, forbidden by law to reach out to people after work hours. And when you have this whole mix, right? And when you have this whole mix and you have this whole Indian mindset of working hard, being hungry, growing quickly, the pace at which we execute, I think the first one is understanding the nuances. Erin Meyer's book, The Culture Map, is a great place to start. Eric Hofstede started it with the Hofstede framework. Just understanding, again, these are very, very generic paint brushes of what cultures, national or, country cultures look like. There are nuances with individuals. You'll always have the off year not complying to the norm, but this is almost like, standardized norms of what culture looks like. It gives you a good lens of how to manage. So, for example, when you have, and I had a British boss, or when you have, a Dutch person communicating with you, the directness with which you will get feedback or not is so stark that you could have a conversation with the person, come back thinking this was fantastic. That person's going back and saying, what was that? So it's also those understanding those nuances of reading between the lines, understanding how direct or indirect somebody is going to be. Are they making decisions solo, or are they making decisions in groups like the Japanese, where all of the decision making happens outside the room, over drinks, over dinner, over years of relationship, and communication happens at, only peer-to-peer levels. So just understanding those nuances to say, when do you, leave some information, when do you pull back, when do you come back, when do you follow up? There's a lot of learning on cultures there. The second bit, I think, would be, this whole ability to collaborate. Again, starting with clarity, being clear about where we are going, collaborating to, build stronger. And for both cultures to also see, or both, companies or leaders, or depending on what model companies are following, for them to be one joined, to have one clear focus rather than two separate directions of travel. And then the third would be, not necessarily taking what worked here will work there. And I think, India has pushed out so much of that with all the localization with organizations. What has worked in the US, what has worked in Europe doesn't work in India. And the corollary is true. What works
Yeah.
in India does not work in other geographies. So, just being open to adapting, inspiring, I think for leaders, the number one quality or, competency would be inspiring, the ability to inspire. This is who I am, this is where I'm coming from, this is where I'm going, and this is why we're working together. That genuine mission and purpose is the single largest trust builder.
Got it. Very nice, Paddy. This actually brings me to the last question and would love to hear your views around this. I think in one of our conversations also we were just discussing where thought leadership as such from an Indian perspective is actually right up there. But unfortunately, we really don't have a lot of articles out over there. We don't have people looking up to some of the great leaders. While there are dime a dozen in India too, most of them are actually from overseas, right? To also add to that, India as a country is still, or at least still recently, was seen more as an execution hub where back office jobs could be outsourced to us and so on and so forth. But that's quickly changing where innovation is taking the center and a lot of thoughts are going around it. So, from your perspective, if we want to actually be the next global power, looked up for a country with the right talent from an innovation perspective, from a thought leadership, and so on and so forth, what would be the next phase? How do we go about it for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
Wow. That's a very long term answer. But you're very right, Dhiren. I think, and again, it goes back to okay, our education system is changing. Let's start there, right? So when we think about the education system in the past, there was a state board, there was a central board, and there was ICSE. The
Okay.
ways of learning were very, very structured with some nuances here and there. And I've studied across ICSE and state board. From there, when you think about the production line, people did their school, they did their engineering or law or medicine or science, arts, commerce, bachelor's. And then, it started becoming this whole world of where everybody was doing an MBA. I'm a product of that, BSc mathematics and an MBA.
Wow.
And when you think about it, right, the whole education system or the way we engaged with our education system was to get out of it, to get into a job, because this was the path that was, pretty much to get into a decent landing and a starting point. That was the purpose of education. You look at the way my child goes to, and she went to a wonderful school a wonderful British school in Singapore. She goes to an IB school here in Bangalore. The way they are taught is extremely different. They are taught by experimenting. They are taught by having a hypothesis and proving and disproving a hypothesis. They're engaging with their education compared to going and, the single purpose is not to get out of it. The purpose somewhere down the line becomes, learning, exploring, and engaging with it differently. Now, why am I starting there? Because if we think about what is the one thing Indians were taught was this is the path, follow it, do it, get out. And the next generation, and with that change, with that openness, with the safety net we talked about before, the current generation has a lot more space to play, a space to learn, a space to experiment. What do we need now is, and again, I'm seeing this changing, is great communication, articulation. These are the real human skills, right? ChatGPT can do all of this writing and, preparing notes, all of that. But the way you show up, the way you communicate, the way you inspire, the way you talk about your vision, the genuine authenticity, those are not things that, ChatGPT or AI can do for us. Those will have to come from the human, how you show up, how you stand up. From there, I think that's one skill. How are you going to inspire people to join you, to be with you, to work with you? The second bit is having that strategic vision and having that space, because, and this is where a lot of leadership development programs with Asian leaders, not just Indian, with Asian leaders focuses on this strategic muscle, because that's the one muscle that's least used. There's been a clear path to follow. You look at China, you look at Japan, you look at Korea, you look at India. The broad majority was following a certain path. And then there were these sparks that were innovating, that were coming up, questioning, even questioning. It's coming into, mainstream education so much. They're questioning what, why, the five whys, and, using that in a different manner. But it really starts with curiosity, questioning, and having a strategic vision and developing that muscle to be able to, really get there, grow, and to inspire.
Got it. Awesome, Rupali. I would love to continue this whole discussion, but just to sum up on the last point that you said, I recollect a few questions that are shot out by the kids to me. I mean, when I say kids, these are like 8, 10, 12 years old. And I recollect back when we were younger, if that was asked to our folks or any elderly person, we were primarily shunned off saying, hey, that's not your business or none of your business, right? But now these kids really don't
Or
get
because
to often.
the best is because I told you so.
I told you so, absolutely. So this was an excellent session, and I think if I'm to sum up the whole thing in a couple of sentences, creating the right space for teams to actually explore, learn, experiment, fail, and go about the whole thing gets very, very important. Sharing what the purpose is, what they really need to get out of it. Lack of goals at times could possibly lead to confusion. I think that gets very, very critical. From a leadership perspective, being patient, going about the whole experimentation piece would help. And yeah, I think with that, I would like to thank you again for taking the time out. Loved having you over this and look forward to many more going forward.
Thank you.